Because democracy basically means by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
Dear friends, we are going to be continuing our study of Hannah Arendt, The Public Sphere, and Leo Strauss with a little bit of another diversion with the work of Shadi Hamid. Now, this work I discovered because I was interested in whether there could be because the idea here is that secularism, or this idea that we have to basically agree on some sort of reasonable principles regarding whatever your religion is in order to be participating in the public sphere, some sort of secularism. Well, that whole process developed in the European context from the wars of religion, Protestant Reformation, all that. That's what developed secularism in the West. Now, there's two ways that we can basically go about this question of secularism. We can say that secularism, there is a notion of secularism that exists regardless of the wars of religion, that we were already some sort of secularity. It's kind of anachronistic secularity that we can look. And a lot of people have that kind of argument. That's not my perspective, because I believe that we look at the world through ideology. So in a way, this Kantian narrative can't really escape. And this is one of the things that Leo Strauss said, and we've learned from Leo Strauss already, which was that the primary problem with progressive politics today is that this notion that that the Holy Family was never really holy because it was economic. Now it's always been economic. Now this is the kind of naturalism through the back door that is allowed on the left, while at the same time pointing your fingers at the right-wingers and saying that they look at lions, tigers, and bears and see naturalism and capitalism as well. Well, the right wing don't just do that. Also, the left wing are doing that with regards to this seeing the Holy Family as as being always economic and never really holy. But there is a more primary problem here, and that more primary problem is about the fact that secularism really stays within a religious context. All of our secular institutions, the secular laws that we have here in the West, they have gone through long processes of evolution, and that's, the crown is still the crown in Canada. The crown is based on what? It's based on the divine right of kings. It's still a Christian ideology. It's still connected. All of those ideas, we're still a constitutional monarchy, right? That monarchy aspect is kind of a divine right of king. There is still a divinity there. There is still so that question is now, from there we have that question of whether there can be a democratic notion within Islam, whether there can be a democratic, what are the historical notions of democracy that can be found within Islam itself. Of course, Islam is very advanced when it comes to some aspects of religion, of society, when it comes to, for example, tolerance, or dealing with the local and the universal. That's Islam does it really well in terms of having some sort of set of universal laws, but also having particular laws depending on applying particularly based on the different cultures. So Islam is advanced in many respects, except when it comes to democracy. So in my research, I've been just kind of wondering about whether there can be some sort of democratic traditions within Islam, and we can find some sort of we can make an argument that the exegetical tradition within Abrahamic thoughts, that is a bunch of rabbis sitting around in a circle discussing what a text means, that was an early form of democratic practice, theological democratic practice, or some sort of stretching of arguments. But instead of doing that, instead of trying to find the history of trying to find some sort of anachronistic history, or this rehistoricization of trying to find some democratic norms by which the Islamic tradition, or by which a theological Islamic tradition can draw upon, so that it can. And why am I thinking about this? Because a lot of people think about the situation in a lot of different Islamic countries right now where people are revolting, especially in Iran. Right? So that's the main question here. But instead of doing that, came up with, I found the work of Shadi Hamid, and he's basically talking about all of these kinds of questions about how we should participate in democracy when democracies do not allow for the outcomes that we expect. And this is the problem that we're seeing in the Western world, which is that people are voting for dictatorships, people are voting for fascists. Now, the issue here, right? The issue here, and I've been always saying this issue, is that whereas when it comes to Persian or other types of villager societies, the notion, the liberal notion, has always been that you need to go out and educate the villager people so that they can participate in the liberal or democratic ideals, and they don't come up with self-destructive ways of destroying democracy from within the democracy. So that's why you need some sort of liberal education to go with democracy. Now, that idea has gone face to face with the new ideas that have destroyed kind of the new liberal ideas compared to the old liberal ideas. The old liberal idea would say something like, I disagree with what you say, but I would fight for the death for your right to say it. That kind of idealization brings democracy together, but instead we are living in a world where for example, it's too much emotional labor to educate you. Nobody wants to engage with anybody. Nobody wants to do civic work. Nobody wants to do volunteer work. And slowly but surely, all of our human social relationships have become a cost-benefit analysis of privilege and emotional labor. And this is largely done by the leftists that have normalized this kind of thing. And ironically, it's the right-wing people who actually discuss anti-capitalism or anti-capitalist possibilities within their communities. And what's funny is that a lot of these ideas of volunteerism are being maintained within the most capitalistic, closed-knit communities in America, whereas in the poor communities have been absolutely ravaged by a lot of these commodification of interpersonal relationships that is, normalized by neoliberal intersectional feminist psychology. Now let's go. We're going to read this book, and this book is going to basically open up a lot of these issues that we're talking about in a much more tangible and a much more practical way than I've been doing with regards to my study of Leo Strauss and Arendt. So hopefully we're going to read it, and I'm going to keep interjecting. This is a really good work. I haven't found a work like this in a long time, so I highly recommend that you take a look at the work yourself without my interjection, but here we go. Thank you for taking the time. Let's read. Is democracy worth supporting? Can the overthrow of a democratically elected leader ever be justified? The case of Chile in 1973, after the socialist Salvador Allende came to power, is perhaps the prototypical example of a persistent American dilemma. Kissinger, perhaps the most influential, controversial policy thinker of the 20th century, memorably put it, "I don't see why we have to stand by and watch a country go communist because of the irresponsibility of its own people." And you can see this kind of same line coming out from the American left, which is, why do these people vote against their own interests? Kissinger could say, with a characteristic mix of coldness and sly wit, in a sentence he has happened to capture rather starkly a tension that would undermine American foreign policy and often render it incoherent. This, I've talked about this before, this is the reason why a lot of people don't support the Americans today, is because of just the pure hypocrisy and the loss of moral the loss of the moral high ground over the last how many years of how many democratically elected governments the Americans government has overthrown. If Allende had won, it would have been called the end of the world, as one Latin American specialist at the State Department wondered. Probably not, but there would have been a cost. This book is about that cost, the cost of democracy producing bad outcomes, and whether it is a cost that Americans should be willing to bear. Now, again, that's kind of a situation, right? When everything becomes a matter of economics, obviously the question becomes no, the answer is no. Whereas in democratic society requires some sort of self-sacrifice to something greater than yourself. More recently, and some sort of sacrifice to this god of the state that you need in a democracy, right? That's why you need some sort of theological thing. That's why democracy was based on the Greek Republic, the Greek city-states, where you only get a vote if you have property and a willingness to die for your city. Nowadays, everybody gets a willy-nilly vote, and the idea of citizenship doesn't mean anything. More recently, in the Middle East, the specter of anti-American Islamists coming to power in the democratic election only to cancel democracy. One person, one vote, one time was a reminder of the tension that was far from resolved. If democracy was about the right to make the wrong choice, why should America indulge in other people's wrong choices? Here, Kissinger once again saw things the same as he saw them in Chile. Referring to the rise of Islamist parties during the Arab Spring, Kissinger wrote that the advocacy of elections may result in only one democratic exercise of them. In other words, democracy might be nice, but it simply wasn't worth the trouble when its results were so uncertain and its participants so unreliable. Islamist parties believe that Islam and Islamic law should play a central role in public life and organizing politically around that goal. And this is one of the things that the progressive left loves to overlook, right? I mean, a lot of these, Islam is a political religion. Islam is a political religion. I mean, look at what, for example, the anti-turban movement that's happening in Iran right now. Compare that to, that's the same issue that's happening in France. Whereas the same person who is arguing in France that we need to allow people to have religious freedom would also argue that it just doesn't make sense. A lot of these intersectional arguments that assume commensurability, assume that we can draw neat parallels between different forms of oppression, and assumes that we're all on the same page when really we're not. In fact, a lot of us as ex-Islamic countries, people, we are totally against the religious, especially Islam, right? So a lot of people are like that. So we don't want to see Islam, and we know exactly how Islam has always been a political religion. But we can see that the left in America, they don't see that perspective, especially pro-Palestinian people, all these kind of things. Not that I'm saying that that's that. So what I'm working on here is that, and same with Shadi Hamidi, so it's kind of the same kind of Shadi Hamid, we're working on the same issue, is that there needs to be some sort of Protestant Reformation, Protestantization of Islam. And that possibility is actually an opportunity, because Islam has some strengths that the Christian religion doesn't have. Islam can maintain this idea of communion that in the Christian world has completely been decimated. Naturally, then they are likely to arouse suspicion. The fear of democracy undone by some people has been as persistent as it has been speculative. Now, the reason why I don't say Islamicists is because we're trying to draw parallels between, again, the villager people, the Islamic people, the religious people, the villager dogmatists in different countries, and the dogmatist villagers in our own country. So the idea here is that you need to take up the emotional labor to talk to your Trump voting cousins. But, nobody wants to do that anymore because capitalism has taken over everything. So if that's the case, then if you have no duty to talk to your cousin, then what's the point of any of this kind of democratic decision making at all? Okay, so let's keep reading. It is the fear that which has not yet happened, which puts defenders of democracy on an uncomfortable position of either reassuring skeptics that Islamists will not win, or that they will win, but they will be good, moderate, and otherwise acceptable. And this is kind of the Obama line, right? When Obama first came in, he tried to make friends with the extreme notions. That quickly fell apart. The more likely scenario is that they might win, but instead of ending democracy, they will do something rather more mundane. They will be bad, at least from the perspective of Western observers. Islamist parties will act against American interests or American values, or both. One of the most persistent, vexing problems for America abroad, and particularly in the Middle East, is that democratic dilemma. We want democracy in theory, but not necessarily when it comes to outcomes in practice. It really reminds a lot of the line from communism, right? We say, same kind of thing with communism. It's good in theory, but in practice it doesn't work. Now it's applying to democracy itself, which is, we live in a scary time if that's the case. There are other big problems, of course: nuclear warfare, climate change, etc., etc., the post-apocalypse, but they are not dilemmas in quite the same way. The democratic dilemma also happens to be uniquely American one. Americans forget that very few countries insist on the promotion of democracy as a core component of their foreign policy, and fewer still have the power to do something about it. Because power and morality are inextricably linked in the American self-conception, the gap between interests and ideals is a question of identity as well as security. Wonderful. And no longer is this purely, even primarily, a foreign policy problem. At home, a growing number of Americans are realizing that the respect for democratic outcomes, when the ideological stakes are high, when those outcomes appear personally threatening, it is easier said than done. To look then at the democratic dilemma abroad is to consider a deeper set of questions about why we believe democracy is good, as well as whether we think it's good for other nations and cultures. To put the question more starkly, is democracy worth it? When increasingly produce what seems to be destructive outcomes that put lives and livelihoods at risk. Why should mere democratic outcomes in elections take precedence over the things that we hold dear, such as liberalism, human rights, social justice, and racial inequality? And this was the kind of the argument that was made a couple years ago by the Homo Deus writer. Homo Deus, he said that, why is it that we can think that human beings have a ability to solve these great social issues, and he was the Homo Deus writer. He was advocating some sort of technocracy instead of some sort of democracy, some sort of artificially intelligent, automated structure. But that also is scary in its own right, especially with ideas of like Neuralink, that where we can, you can have a rat that can make a decision to go left or right and would think that it's its own decision, even though it's connected to a remote control. And you put that same helmet on a human being, you put that remote control helmet on the human being, you make the human being go left and right. That human being is going to think that he's making his own decision. So maybe technocracy, especially this Black Mirror technocracy, shouldn't be our answer, but it increasingly is becoming our answer. So that's what the question is here. I mean, should we continue to invest in democracy? And I think that the way that we're putting that question is absolutely wrong, because if we are investing in democracy, we're always going to not get back on our investment. Democracy is not an investment. It can't be an investment. It's outside of the capitalist structure. Democracy is something that you need to put your life on the line to participate in. You have to be if you have to have a voice in the public sphere, you must defend your voice in the public sphere, as well as defend the person that you disagree with, and you have to put the life on the line to defend the person that you disagree with. But those are kind of like idealistic notions, right? This book proposes an ambitious and controversial reimagining of the ongoing debate and argues for democratic minimalism as a path to resolving America's democratic dilemma. I just want to say that Fukuyama actually responded to this book as well, so you should take a look at Fukuyama's response. I didn't think it was that fruitful, but Fukuyama's deep within this as well. Zizek, Fukuyama, all these ideas as well. In the seemingly eternal tension between democracy and liberalism, recognized by the ancient Greeks, the founders of the chroniclers like Alexis de Tocqueville and alike, it may be time to prioritize one over the other, rather than acting as if the two are intertwined when increasingly they are not. As a matter of policy, okay, so here I think that Fukuyama had a really good critique of this. He says that, how we define liberalism and how we define democracy we can elude all of these kind of overly logical kind of things by just how we set our terms of a discussion. So really we can define democracy with some sort of liberalism, and we can define liberalism with some sort of democracy. Big democracy, big D democracy, little d democracy, big L liberalism, little L liberalism. And the methodology that Shadi uses in this book from the outset is not so strong, but the sense that he has for what is also being talked about in my channel with regards to the public sphere is very on point. Especially, and the reason why I'm talking about this is because this same issue is happening with regards to the Jewish question in Europe. So this is something that Hamid doesn't really talk about, that the Jewish question in Europe with regards to Leo Strauss and Hannah Arendt, that they both talk about it. This is the same kind, the Europeans are having this debate with regards to European Jewry. As a matter of policy, What if there was a way to focus on democratic promotion in the literal and narrower sense, rather than the promotion of both democracy and liberalism? There is an argument to be made for liberalism promotion, but it is not the one that I will be making here. Instead, democratic minimalism would privilege democracy with its emphasis on the preferences of majorities or pluralities through regular elections and the rotation of power, over liberalism, which prioritizes individual freedoms, personal autonomy, and social progressivism. So again, our definitions here, as Fukuyama already criticized, are a little bit iffy, but we get what he's saying. We don't want to be pedantic like Fukuyama was. Deciding on such a course would alter America's basic foreign policy orientation, providing the beginnings of a grand strategy at a time when the United States seemed unmoored and aimless abroad. Yeah, because it's sold out its own moral legitimacy over the last 50 years, 100 years. It doesn't have any moral standing to stand on, especially after Trump. It would transform bilateral relationships in the Middle East and our engagement with Muslim electorates more broadly. And it would help shape our understanding of democracy at home, at a time when the Americans are losing faith in American ideals. In addition, it would better preserve Americans' national interests, if not necessarily in the short term, in the long term, adapting a course as new and undoubtedly risky as this is no easy task, but there are compelling reasons, both moral and strategic, to attempt it. Now, Hamid argues that, for example, when we are supporting authoritarian regimes that have made deals with Israel for peace and stability, in the short term, that might be helpful, but in the long term, those dictatorial regimes are rather brittle, and they can't deal with the social undercurrents that are basically anti-Israeli sentiments. So what we have to do is we need to do the hard work. Again, we need to do the hard work of talking to people, changing minds. Again, as Denzel Washington says, you cannot legislate love. And what we've done is, with the moralization of the commodification of emotional labor, we've killed the social in socialism. So we're not willing to talk to each other. If nobody's willing to talk to each other, then democracy is in peril. Why would something as controversial as this be a good idea, and now? For starters, it would revive democracy's promotion after being declared dead. But it would do so while taking into account a changing national mood and the limits of American power. Today, there is little appetite for the cultural and social engineering that was implicit in the liberal expansionist heyday of the 90s and 2000s. Moreover, it would allow the United States to move away from the Middle East blunders of the past several presidents, each of whom, while radically different in temperament, ended up falling back on authoritarian regimes to diminishing returns. To put it as simply as possible, support for the Arab authoritarian regimes undermines our interests over time while violating the values we still claim to uphold. Saudi Arabia being the ultimate example of this. Saudi Arabia, which recently screwed over the United States with regards to the oil deals with regards to Russia. Oh my goodness. Saudi Arabia, how many times has it screwed over the Americans, the American policy? And how many times and the reason, I guess why, is because the oil is so important for, the oil is so important for the American military, something like that. And Saudi Arabia needs America to counter, I guess, Iran, right? Iran is what's the problem with Saudi Arabia and Iran, in short, is that they are both basically having a claim on the rule of Shahida, or the rule of Islamic law. Who is the ultimate ruler of Islamic law? The Shia clergy in Iran, or the Saudi princes? Of course, interests and values are intertwined in complex ways, so willfully undermining our own values ends up weakening the US leverage and credibility, and allows regimes to disregard American exhortations as mere rhetoric to be disregarded with a wink of an eye. It's unfortunate. On a broader level, America's rising global preeminence from the early 20th century and the 21st century coincided with its commitment to the spread of democracy abroad. Of course, he's going to have as editors of an overview U.S. democracy note, honed in this first instance as a means of countering European imperialism, and later given even sharper definition of a struggle against fascism and communism, it was no mere talisman, but the cutting edge of the United States' rise to world power status. Interesting. So, okay. I mean, we're just going to take it at face value. That one country was democratic and claimed it was better because it was democratic had an important demonstration effect. The more the United States eclipsed the Soviet Union, the more pro-democracy forces found themselves buoyed. The counterfactual is perhaps even more illustrative, and it is almost too self-evident to state. If the Soviet Union had somehow beaten the United States, although it's never been made exactly clear what this would mean, the so-called third wave of democratization across Eastern Europe would not have happened. The fact that American hypocrisy is so often brought up by critics of US foreign policy, including myself, is a testament to the fact that critics believed that the United States was capable of being better and judged it accordingly. Exactly, right? I have expectations for the American left, right? That's why I criticize it. I don't have any expectations for the right. The charge of hypocrisy is only effective if the country in question is good at least some of the time. Calling out the Soviet Union for similar hypocrisies would have made little sense. No one, not even its most fervent supporters, expected Soviet leaders to respect democracy. Instead, the goal was rather explicit: the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is true that Stalin atrocities turned against the socialist project, but this had less to do with the elections and popular representations and more to do with the difficulty and even true believers had in stomaching mass killing on an epic scale. Now, what Hamid is doing here is in fact a form of exegetical analysis in terms of the United States. What does that mean? What is exegetical analysis? Exegetical analysis is that you take the book for what it is and you only look at that book, or you only look at America for what it says it is, and then judge it by its own merits. Not judge it by something outside of history or judging it by different standards. Okay, you judge it by its own standards. The author, Robert Kagan, characterizes it somewhat differently, emphasizing the legacy of the Enlightenment. After World War II, because of America's unrivaled power, those Enlightenment principles suddenly enjoyed a force behind them that they had never seen before. Which Enlightenment principles might these have been? In Kagan's estimation, it's liberalism and democracy, as well as capitalism, went together. They did, in fact, go together. But that is a different thing. I mean, and this is the problem, right? This is from a long time ago, I guess, and obviously it's the case that capitalism and democracy don't have to be together, or liberalism. This might seem, and you have to take a look at Raymond Goyce, his really good book on liberalism and the contradictions of liberalism. This might seem like an odd time to sing the praises of democracy, whether at home or abroad, particularly as fears over democracy staying in power continue to grow, including in my own country, the US. And he has to say it here, he has to say, including my own country, bros, I'm a Democrat. As the Dutch historian David van Reybrouck put it, there is something strange going on with democracy. Everyone seems to want it, but no one believes in it any longer. Even if we did believe in it, haven't we already tried promoting it in the Middle East and failed spectacularly? Bush's freedom agenda is the most obvious example. Obviously, the problem with that is that it was all just rhetoric and they were just extracting the country of resources like they usually do. The freedom agenda was certainly bold and drew considerable form of controversial intellectual premises. In many ways, it was the patriotic update of so-called blame America first arguments associated with left-wing activists, which made it all the more ironic coming from the Bush and neoconservatives. Their argument was also intuitive. In the absence of democracy, the basic political rights, citizens are more likely to resort to violence because they lack peaceful, constructive means to express their grievances. Accordingly, September 11th did not happen because they hated our freedom, but rather because the Middle East's stifling political environment bred anger, frustration, and ultimately violence. However, the Bush administration's commitment to the freedom agenda didn't last. After a brief period of apparent democratic opening in 2004 and 2005, American officials backtracked after Islamist parties made significant electoral gains. In the Palestinian territories, the election militant group Hamas became a new cautionary tale, just as much as Chile was in the Cold War. While the Bush administration understood the importance of elections, perhaps to a fault, it incorrectly assumed that they would produce moderate outcomes. It is now the stuff of legend. The National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice's heart skipped a beat when she first heard the news of Hamas's victory while running on her treadmill at 5 in the morning. It's easy to poke fun of moments like this that grow in significance with passing of time. We know Hamas won, but it would have been otherwise. It couldn't have been otherwise, could it? But it could have been otherwise. Couldn't it have been? There have been a world in which moderates of Fatah might have won instead, and those who believed in such a world would have been drawing on considerable academic literature. The belief and the participation and moderation went hand in hand, also happened to be intuitive, even if it turns out to be wrong. So here is one of the definitions of conservatism that's really interesting. Conservatism is when you pay attention to the stupidity of the masses and respond to that, right? That's what conservatism is. You are speaking on behalf of the uneducated masses, is kind of like this conservative perspective. The assumption was that the average person is concerned about educating his or her children, making a living. In retrospect, he, like so many others, wondered how much good faith to extend to a fickle electorate. There's no question that some of us vote for Hamas was a protest against Fatah, but how much of it was that? And how much of it was the notion that Israel needs to be destroyed, and that the only way to do that was effectively through violence? It's not zero. I mean, it's 5%, 35%. Same thing in Egypt. While people voted for the Brotherhood, what are they voting for? And you know how many of them were actually truly Islamitists? Maybe they were too optimistic in thinking, they're voting for a good government, they're voting to end corruption. Most Americans, however, were not paying attention to the complex voting patterns of Palestinians or Egyptians. What they would have been aware was a narrative of military supremacy and liberal ambitions, with the Bush administration attempting to aggressively spread its values and try its hand at social engineering in the form of nation-building projects in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, we do need to do some social engineering. The question is whether it should be done through civil society and social forms that are too much emotional labor, or through laws and coercion and dictatorships. Indeed, this has been the most persistent critique of America's post-Cold War foreign policy, that it has been led astray by an increasingly outdated version of liberal hegemony. Realist critics like Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, as well as younger scholars on the left like Stephen Wertheim, argue that these more expansive conceptions of liberal foreign policy aim to increase the prevalence of liberal democracies. As this suggests, realists generally see liberal expansionism abroad as a natural extension of the universal tendencies inherent in liberals. If we accept the premise that liberalism is not neutral, then, like any ideological orientation, it will have some trouble restricting its own application. It will want more of itself. Social reproduction. On this, they have a point. The question is whether it is possible or desirable to limit excesses of liberal hegemony while still retaining a pro-democracy posture abroad. If liberal dreams, a desire to make the world into our image, have fueled American hubris, then these excesses can be mitigated by a conscious decision to put less emphasis on liberal and in the promotion of liberal democracy. Put less emphasis on the word liberal in the promotion of liberal democracy. What if instead we wished other countries to be mere democracies, emphasizing democracy as a system, means of governing and rotating power with no prejudice to substantive ideological outcomes? This would allow us to respect other countries' right to self-determination and government. It would limit our need to engage in social engineering in countries that American officials don't necessarily understand. It would also resolve our democratic dilemma, particularly at a time when it seems that more and more electorates are deciding they would rather not be liberal. The two core components of liberal democracy are diverging. For most of the modern era, the two concepts had gone hand in hand, at least in the West. The classical liberal tradition, emerging out of the Enlightenment, after Europe exhausted itself with the wars of belief, prioritizes non-negotiable personal freedoms and individual rights autonomy, eloquently captured in documents like the Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, democracy, while requiring some minimal protection of rights to allow for fair and meaningful competition, is more concerned with popular sovereignty, popular will, and responsiveness to the voting public. In the suggestively titled The People versus Democracy, Yashka Monk discusses this disjuncture. On the one hand, the preference of the people are increasingly illiberal. Voters are growing impatient with independent institutions and less willing to tolerate the rights of ethnic and religious minorities. On the other hand, elites are taking hold of the political system and making it increasingly unresponsive. The powerful are less and less willing to cede to the views of people. So both the democracy and liberalism are receding. That democracy, and I guess he's saying that it's because they are too much entangled with one another. The democracy and liberalism can diverge is not a novel observation, but it has become more of an obvious late, not only in the might-be democracies of the Middle East, but also in the actual democracies, old and such as new, such as Italy, France, Poland, Israel, India, and Brazil. In each of these countries, illiberal right-wing parties have risen to power through democratic means. Their commitment to individual freedoms and minority rights has been questionable at best. At times, they have been actively hostile to liberal tradition. The ascendancy and hegemony of liberal democracy during the Cold War and its seemingly triumph after communism fall made it easy to forget that the story of politics is a story of struggle between liberal and democratic impulses, found as they are on different conceptions of the human needs and wants. Whether the United States should emphasize liberal values, such as supremacy of the individual over the collective, gender equality, minority rights, sexual freedom, or electoral democracy hinges on perceptions of what is or should be universal across time and place and what is not. For the US, such debates are inescapable. The country, after all, is founded on a set of universal premises about rights and the sovereignty of the individual. If history has a progressive arc in which good things go together and amplify each other, why shouldn't they go together in the Middle East? For its part, the realist tradition in international affairs tend to balk at overwrought talk of universal values. For the good liberal, and we do have actually a universal value, the universal value of capitalism. For the good liberal, individual rights and protections for minorities are sacrosanct, even if such protections run afoul in the majority of borders. Even if liberalism matters within borders, it should also matter outside of them. Values are important in and of themselves, but they also help nations project soft power abroad. This power may be amorphous, but this doesn't make it less real. For the good realists, anything that attracts the label soft carries less weight. In the place of values and arcs bending towards justice, the sense of tragic is paramount. Because humans are fallible, neo-utopian notions of a more perfect world and a global system where norms are enforceable are inherently flawed. Instead, anarchy defies the international realm. Power is the only true currency. Values may matter, but they are secondary and at best are mere luxuries to be indulged in after the question of power is given due consideration. For the purposes of transparency, I have been an outspoken critic of realism in its various iterations. While I am sympathetic to maintaining a developed sense of the tragic, I do not believe that the further de-emphasizing the values in international affairs is the right response to a tragic world, particularly if it offers an easy pretext for excusing more tragedy. That said, realist arguments, however much I disagree with the balance of power premises, need to be engaged in with good faith. Such arguments are gaining traction across the ideological spectrum. Two prior presidents, Trump and Obama, didn't have much in common, but they did share skepticism about the possibilities of American power, particularly when it comes to the sickiness of culture. To the surprise of some, Obama recycled the controversial ancient hatreds thesis in his final State of the Union address, while President Trump promoted his own vision of cultural sovereignty, declaring at the United Nations that each of us today is the emissary of a distinct culture.
Government by the retarded, for the retarded,